May set aside the steaming hot chocolate and got up to open the door. She walked a little slower than usual. Age was slowly becoming a problem for her. She tried to add a step as she walked to the front door, feeling that the more movement in her gait, the better she felt. Like so much else in her recent life, it was a case of fake it till you make it. Recent events had made it difficult. She had many worries, but today she had to put them aside and lend her support to someone who needed her full attention. Through the frosted glass of the door, she saw the figures of two people. She opened the door, smiling welcomingly, as a good hostess should. "Hello," she said, genuinely pleased at the sight of her visitors. Buffalo Grove, the town in the northern suburbs of Chicago where she lived, was cold. So cold you could see your breath. She had a house in a rustic neighborhood just off the main street, close enough that she could walk to the little tourist traps of the old-timey buildings, but she never did. She'd lived here for almost 7 years now, having become an integral part of the town, having moved there after her troubles in the Champaign-Urbana town of southern Illinois. The two women on the doorstep said hello to her, breathless from the cool air, clearly eager to come in from the cold. Come in, it's cold outside." "Winter came early this year," she said, pushing back and letting the guests into the warm house. The two women entered the house, knowing the way. They had been here before, many times. In a large room with vaulted ceilings, paneled with large pine beams, a fire burned in the hearth. Around the fireplace, which was a semicircle with a hood, were two upholstered armchairs and a sofa, similar to the round fireplaces you see in ski lodges. Family photos hung on the wall, knickknacks of a life lived stood on shelves, a television hung above the fireplace, and in the corner, in front of the tightly closed French windows, stood a baby grand piano, gleaming white enamel, with more photos neatly laid out on top of the varnish. On one wall hung a grandfather clock, accurately showing the time. Both guests removed their coats and scarves, placing them neatly on a coat rack that had been placed by the door just for such occasions. "Hello, May. How are you doing? Cold enough for you?" the first, tall brunette asked. She was no stranger to the gym and worked out a lot. May rolled her eyes. "So, why is that the first thing everyone says as soon as the cold weather hits?" she asked with a slight southern tinge in her voice. "Everyone always says, 'Is it cold enough for you?' And it's really annoying. Yes, it is cold. We all feel it." May did her best to mimic a Chicago accent, and both women exchanged smiles. May was in a good mood again. "I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it, May. It's just a greeting," the second woman, Rhonda Ranta, said with contrived solemnity. Rhonda was tall as well, but a little shorter than Gina, about 5 feet 8 inches, but she made up for it with the high heels she invariably wore. Rhonda had short blonde hair, clear pale skin, and was the living embodiment of Scandinavian beauty. Although she had lived in the United States for over 13 years, she had a very noticeable accent, sometimes missing words and sentences when she was agitated or in a hurry. Today she was dressed for the elements. Tight tights, leather boots with 3-inch heels, and a long knit dress with a built-in scarf attached to her neck with Velcro. Gina was wearing perfect makeup, exactly the right amount of foundation, blush, and eye makeup, while Rhonda wore no makeup at all. And both looked good. Gina looked around and asked May, "So she's not here yet?" May moved to a padded chair closer to the door and shook her head, sitting down. "Not yet. I said any time after 4, so I guess it won't be long." She gestured to the tea and coffee spread out on the coffee table and said, "Help yourselves, ladies." Rhonda sighed and said, "So we're doing it again, huh? Opening old wounds again?" "That's exactly what we're doing," Gina replied sharply. "You know it's good for our souls, and those who seek us out need to know that we're just like them. As good or bad as they are, they need to feel comfortable. That's the only way to get them to open up so we can give them the support they need. Also, telling stories is cathartic. Every time I do it, I find some new dimension. I explore it a little more. I probe that wobbly tooth with my tongue again, and one day, fingers crossed, it will come out." Rhonda looked at Gina again and sighed. I know, I know. It's just that sometimes I feel like I don't. Like it just makes me feel worse. Reliving everything all over again. It makes it almost hard to move on, you know? Well, Rhonda, no one's forcing you to go back. I'd say that when you're ready to move on with your life, you probably won't need us anymore. The fact that you're still here? May held out one hand, the other holding the still steaming hot chocolate. Rhonda smiled faintly, shrugged, and began pouring herself a cup of coffee. There was an awkward silence for a moment as May stared off into the distance and Gina and Rhonda poured their coffee. Gina caught Rhonda's eye and gave her a slightly embarrassed look. They settled down on the couch, each took a sip, and then Gina asked, "So, did anyone watch The Good Wife last night?" Rhonda frowned. God, we must be desperate if we're talking about that nonsense. Good coffee, May, she said, nodding toward May. May smiled back, weakly but still far away in her thoughts. But it can't be any worse than that awful crap Deanna used to make, can it? Remember? Rhonda said, making gagging motions with her finger in her mouth. Rhonda chuckled. Yeah, that was pretty bad, wasn't it? The doorbell rang, and all three looked expectantly in that direction. Well, May said, setting aside her hot chocolate, I guess I'll have to be the hostess with the mostest. She went off to open the door, leaving Gina and Rhonda behind. How I wish Deanna was still here, Gina said wistfully. Well, she's got her own life, Rhonda. She's moved away. We still see her from time to time, but she doesn't need us anymore. Trey took care of that. And Ryan, Rhonda muttered under her breath. She was still slightly annoyed that all their planning and scheming hadn't resulted in the desired outcome. See, events after the game. Ed. Then May burst into the room, leading a young woman who was no more than 30. She was a bottle blonde, with dark roots running through her hair. She had fair skin, with a slight redness around her eyes and nose that indicated she had been out in the cold too much. Or cried too much. Or both. She was wearing a light summer coat over a stretchy knee-length wool dress, and she was clearly cold. And these are the girls. This is Rhonda and Gina, said May, and led the newcomer into the room. You look cold, dear. Gina, would you be a dear and get Brooklyn some coffee? She needs to warm up. It's Brooklyn, isn't it? Do you prefer Brooke? Brooklyn looked around, assessing the room and trying not to be too conspicuous at the sight of the other two women. What? Oh yes, Brooke. Brooklyn. Bree, whatever. I answer to anything. Just not, hey, slut. I've had enough of that from Josh. Here, sit in front of the fire, dear. Sugar? Milk? Brooklyn lowered herself into the chair at right angles to the couch and looked gratefully at Gina, who handed her coffee, pouring it from the fine china tea set on the coffee table. No, please, Black. How do you like your men? Rhonda asked, trying to brush it off and immediately realizing it was the worst thing to say. Don't mind her, dear. She thinks she's funny. We don't have the heart to point out to her otherwise, May replied calmly, noticing the distressed look on Brooklyn's face. Sorry, Rhonda said. I'm not thinking straight. Worried. New person, you know how it is. Brooklyn held her gaze for a moment, and they saw the internal struggle to escape. Eventually, the struggle won out, and she said simply, It's fine, in a voice that said that maybe it was fine, but don't do it again or you'll get your ass kicked. Fine, as all men have realized by now, is a code word for women. It actually means totally not fine, but I'll accept it and not do it again. It's a word that makes men cringe. It was obvious to the short woman that Brooklyn wouldn't put up with extra crap. So, Brooke, we've got kind of a standard way of melting the ice here. I know you're hurting. We've all been there and can emphasize that. We know you need support, or you wouldn't have come to us. Don't be afraid to talk a lot at this meeting. We are here to bare our souls to you rather than the other way around. We want you to know that this is a safe place, and the only way we can do that is by telling you our stories. To let you know you are among friends. Brooklyn looked at Gina and smiled uncertainly. That sounds good, I guess. I don't know. I'm all messed up right now. I've done so much and I just don't know what to do. He hardly ever talks to me. It's mostly his shark lawyer. We, never got along. He's a weasel. Gina sat down on the edge of the couch, reached out and placed her hand on Brooklyn's arm. It's okay. We've been where you are now. Things are getting better. Slowly, but it's getting there. I think, darling, another thing we should note is that we're not a man-destroying group. We're not a coven of embittered women who think all men are bad. As I said on the phone, we are here to support each other and try to get our lives back on track. We've all made mistakes and we don't hide it. This is not the place to justify our actions. If that's what you need to move on. We recognize the mistakes we've made and try to accept them, or as they say today, take them on. And move on, rather than making it all someone else's fault, May said, stepping into the conversation. Yes, Rhonda said, nodding her head in response to May's comment. Yes, we have to admit our guilt. There may have been extenuating circumstances, but they have to be dealt with individually. We all screwed up, and part of the job of this little group is to accept that and help each other move on. Like a 12-step program, only without all those pesky steps. No higher powers making me twitch, that's for sure. So, I just don't know what to do right now. I'm sued, living in this shitty one-bedroom apartment. I've seen the kids 4 times since all this happened, and the only lawyer I can afford is really disgusting. Josh says he'll treat me fine in the divorce, but I don't want a divorce and he won't even have a serious conversation with me. We talk, but it doesn't immediately devolve into name-calling. Brooklyn wheezed at the end of her story, getting more and more frustrated as she continued. It's okay. Don't worry, Brooke. We're here to help. We're not going to help you get revenge or try to financially destroy your husband, but you're not alone. We've been through what you're going through, and we'll be there for you. Why? Brooklyn snorted, glancing from woman to woman, genuine curiosity struggling on her face with self-pity. Why would you do that? You don't know me? You don't know what I've done. What I'm still doing. The last sentence sounded like a piteous shriek. Rhonda and Gina looked at each other, a little concerned. Trying to explain why they had done what they had done was difficult. It was painful for each of the women present. Well, if you want to explain to us why you're here, you don't have to go into details, Rhonda began. No, it's okay. I can do that. I can talk about it. I need to talk about it. No one in my family wants to hear it, and God knows Josh doesn't. Are you sure, honey? May asked softly, sitting up and leaning forward. We really don't want to put you in a difficult position. No, it's all right. It's going to be hard, but I think I need to do it. To explain, Brooklyn said, giving May a small but appreciative smile. Well, okay. The floor is all yours, Brooklyn. Stop whenever you want, May said, holding out her hand and gesturing to the room as a whole. Okay, I'm Brooklyn. Brooklyn Stone. Or rather, I used to be. I think I'll be Brooklyn Hall again soon. Oh. Brooke was silent for a few moments, mulling over what she had said. None of the other women spoke, giving her time to calm down. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the background. Brooklyn looked up, suddenly realizing that she had just stopped talking. Anyway, I was, I guess, married to Josh Stone. I'm 32. I know I look young. I always have. Josh is 35. I'm from here, born and raised in Orland Park in the South. Josh is also a Chicago native, Irish from way back. Big family, siblings, you know how it is. One brother's a cop, the other 2 are firemen. Josh is some kind of financial advisor. He doesn't do trading, he used to, but the stress was too much. Now he's a strategic consultant, advises companies on trading strategies and stuff. In his spare time, he works with a small group of software developers to write some sort of auto trader for iPhones or something like that. I don't know exactly. Brooklyn shook her head, as if annoyed that she couldn't remember something. Anyway, I'm a paralegal. I work at a law firm downtown. I was going to be an attorney, but the cost of taking the exam, plus the hours I work. Well, I didn't want to sacrifice my life, you know. We've been married for 8 years. We have 2 kids, Tara and Adrian. Amazing kids. I know everyone says that, but mine are, well, they really are. Brooklyn smiled to herself, then opened the Photos app on her phone and found the kids folder. Here, take a look, she said, holding out her phone to Gina. Gina couldn't help but notice that Brooklyn's hand was shaking. Gina looked, leaning over to Rhonda and making the appropriate noises that people make in these situations. She then handed the phone to Rhonda, and she handed it to May, who did the same. So, Gina asked, slowly handing the phone back to Brooke. Oh, yeah, said Brooklyn. Well, it was good, you know? A good marriage. Josh was amazing. We met at a church party. I mean, neither of us are particularly religious. I was just serving cakes with my sister. She's a pastry chef. And he was there as part of the Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. I mean, that's Josh, the big Boy Scout and savior of the world. Well, the lost world anyway. It was one of those things called love at first sight, you know? Brooklyn spoke wistfully, looking back. Gina looked at Rhonda with a smirk. Both knew exactly what she was talking about. We just chatted for hours and we had a phone number. He insisted on taking a picture of himself on my phone to attach to the contact number he added, and then insisted I do the same. Anyway, you know how it is. Dates, movies, flowers, food, hot evenings, romance, the whole 9 yards. If there was a romantic gesture to be made, he made it. He even had his dog deliver the ring to me when he proposed. My family just adored him. And I think he liked me. Well, partially liked, that's for sure. Too much. The last 2 words were spoken as if in a low voice. Gina and Rhonda looked at each other again, and Gina risked a quick glance at May, who was watching Brooklyn uninterruptedly. They had obviously gotten to the point, and it didn't take a surgeon to see where this was going. We had years where everything was just great. Josh was attentive, good in bed, no complaints. I had my share of men. I know what's good and what's not, and he's never had any complaints about me. Our kids are great. We don't fight that often. We have a nice house in Schaumburg, far enough away from the family that they don't stand on our doorstep, you know. But close enough that we can easily visit them whenever we want. Everything, it's been great. Which makes what I did even more stupid. I was having an affair with his brother Michael. For 3 months. I don't even know how it started. We were at a barbecue, had a few beers, and the stupid flirting started. I mean, we all flirt a little. Not a lot, just a little. That's what his family does, and I just shot back. Gotta stand up for yourself, you know. Somehow it happened. I still don't know exactly how it happened. I wasn't too drunk to realize what I was doing. I was just like out of my mind, you know? I look back and I can't figure out what I was thinking, what I was feeling. It was just the way it was. The flirting was getting more and more serious, and somehow I ended up there. I still don't know why. Gina and Rhonda exchanged glances, while May continued to watch Brooklyn. It was a familiar story. And it was, well, it was good, you know? Exciting, mysterious, wrong, naughty, I don't know. It was just, fun. I was almost out of my mind, doing things I knew I shouldn't be doing. Anyway, we did it. I couldn't help myself. Suddenly, it was the worst thing I could have done. And then Brooklyn stopped talking and looked at the other women and their reactions, a fear of judgment reflected on her face. You don't need to go into details, my dear, May said softly. We don't need details if you're uncomfortable. Rhonda and Gina remembered their first meeting with the group. It had taken them a while to get the details out, but Brooklyn apparently had no trouble going into gruesome detail. Apparently, it was part of her nature. With this girl, there was no avoiding the detailed truth. I couldn't even look at Josh for the rest of the party. And as for having fun with him, forget it. I couldn't do that with him. I felt like all he had to do was look at me and he'd realize what I'd done. He would. But he didn't. He did wonder what was wrong, though, since I was so quiet and restless, but he just said he'd give me space and be there for me when I wanted to talk. I mean, yeah. Boy Scout, like I said. Talk to him. Yeah, like I was going to do that. I spent a week going through what I did. Tried to understand it. I swore I'd never be alone in the same room with Michael again. I wasn't in love with him. It was more of an interest in what we were doing than in the man himself, you know? She looked anxiously around at the other women, and Gina and Rhonda glanced over again, this time with a strained smile that indicated that yes, they knew exactly what she meant. Gina said quietly, "Yes," and Rhonda just nodded. May patted Brooklyn's hand and said, "I think we understand, Brooklyn. We understand all too well. We understand." Brooklyn took a deep breath and continued. "Well, my determination was enough for 2 weeks. Then, when Josh wasn't at some evening meeting, Michael showed up. I didn't even want to let him in, but he said he needed to borrow one of Josh's tools, and I had to do it. The kids were at a friend's house, and not 3 minutes later, he was there, entertaining me. And the worst part was, the last word came out as a sob. I wanted to do it. I don't know, I barely looked Michael in the eye. That's how it all started. So Michael just showed up sometimes when he knew Josh wouldn't be around, and the kids were busy. We didn't talk much. We didn't even mention Josh or the kids or his fiancée. They were just topics we never touched on. We both realized it was kind of liberating, you know? There was no love involved. We even took his fiancée and himself out to dinner, and when they were there were no longing looks. There was nothing to indicate that we were in any other relationship. I was just his toy, and he was mine. I felt guilty, but like it was just a part of my mind. I was still functioning as the wife I had always been. There were times when I turned Josh down. There were a few times I initiated him in a romantic way. I needed to make sure I still loved my husband, and I did. Love. This was no different. Even better, because I had something to compare the lack of love from Michael to. Josh was gentle. He loved me and didn't rush me. And then everything turned to shit. Everything came out. Brooklyn wiped her eyes as she said the last sentence, and emotions rushed from everywhere. I still don't know how Josh found out about it. I guess it doesn't really matter. Michael called me and said, "He knows," and then hung up. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what Josh really knew, if he knew to what extent, or what. Whether he knew we were doing this in our house, or what he might know. I didn't know if I should leave, or what I should do. So I cleaned the house and waited for him to come home. He never came, at least not that night. I didn't know whether to call him or wait or whatever. The kids asked where he was, and I told them he had things to do at work. He showed up 3 days later looking like hell. I didn't know what to do. I tried to go up to him and hug him, but he wouldn't even touch me. He was so hurt. And hurt by what he was saying. He called me a whore and a slut. I found out later that he attacked Michael and excommunicated him as a brother. And he gave his parents an ultimatum that they had to do it too. Otherwise, they would lose him as a son. He told Michael's fiancée about it, and now she would seek me out. I didn't know what to do. I tried to talk to him, but all he kept saying was to shut up and leave. 4 days later, I was handed a summons. They even had pictures of us. He told me to leave, and I started packing for the kids, and then he grabbed me and yelled that I was leaving, and they weren't. I was scared for the first time, so I packed what I could and left as fast as I could. He was unshaven, angry, his eyes were red, and he was so mad. I mean, I can understand him. I betrayed him along with his brother. But I was, terrified. He was so angry. I'd never seen him like that before. I don't think he would hurt me, but his eyes were so wild. Gina and May exchanged looks full of sympathy. It's all right. That's in the past, and this is now. There's no judgment here, May said softly. Brooklyn let out a small sob and then smiled embarrassedly at the three women. I'm sorry, she said. I thought I was done with this. She gathered her thoughts for another moment and then smiled, both brave and fragile at the same time. So, I'm here, in a crappy studio apartment. He's sued for adultery. His brother is completely cut out of the family. I see the kids, and they still don't quite get it. Josh doesn't hide them from me, but makes sure we don't cross paths when I see them. I take them away from his parents and bring them back. Brooklyn was silent for a moment, looking off into the distance. Then she whispered, "But that's not the worst of it." Ah! The other three women just stared at her while she shifted her gaze from one face to another. "I don't know if I can even say it out loud," she said, dropping her gaze to the floor again. After a few moments of silence, she said impulsively, "I'm still doing it." A shocked silence ensued while the other women digested this nugget. "He calls me sometimes, tells me to be at the motel, and for some reason I go," she said languidly, still staring at the floor. "I don't have anything else to do. Josh makes sure I have enough money to live on, but not much more. I've been thinking about going back to work. I thought about ending it all, but then I remembered about the kids. But when Michael calls, I go. It's a mechanical action. I don't even know why I go. I think now he wants to get even for everything." There was silence at this revelation, each of the women coping with the shock and trying to figure out how to react. May was the first to pull herself together. She calmly said, "Well, I have to ask, do you want to do this? Go to him?" Brooklyn whispered, "No," and continued to just stare at the carpet. "Well then," May spoke again, "I think we need to do something about it. Rhonda, do you still have that spare room?" Rhonda nodded. "I think young Brooklyn should stay with you. It'll be all right now, won't it?" It wasn't so much a question as a statement, but Rhonda didn't mind. She understood, in part, what was going on in Brooklyn's head, and she wanted to help. She nodded vigorously. "Of course I do. I'll follow Brooke home and help her pack. If that's okay with you, Brooke?" Brooklyn looked up, tears staining her makeup. "You do that?" "Of course," Gina replied softly. "We'll make it work. You need support and help. That Kusipaya is hunting you. You need help to confront him and drive him away, and we're here to help you." "Then it's settled," May said with some satisfaction. "Brooklyn, you can stay with Rhonda until you get the hang of it, and she'll drive you around and keep that disgusting man away from you. Frankly, it looks like he got what he deserved by seducing his own brother's wife." "Really?" Everyone sat down for a moment, and Brooklyn reached into her purse and pulled out a pack of face wipes, which she began wiping away mascara smudges with. "Are you seeing any therapists, honey?" May asked after a few minutes of thought. "No. I've thought about it, but I don't know how to find one. I want to see a marriage counselor with Josh, but he won't talk to me about it." May nodded. "Well, I think that's quite normal, my dear. Given the situation and his low opinion of you, he doesn't want to hear your voice right now. And I'm not entirely sure he's wrong or that it's a bad thing. While it's true that there's only a certain amount of time when you can change things, it's also true that if the offended party doesn't want to even try at that point, it won't work. It's better to take the time to sort yourself out, realize what happened, get help and tools to deal with it, and then go back and try to talk. It may be too late, but going with despair on top of despair is not a good way to go either. The fact that he's at least talking to you instead of just cutting you off completely is already a big plus." Gina interjected. "Brooklyn should use my woman. She's really good." "What about the guy Deanna used?" May asked. Gina shook her head. "She needs a woman, May. Look at her." May looked at Brooklyn, who was slowly crying again. "Yes, you're probably right. Can you picture Gina?" May asked. "Of course. You know that," replied Gina, happy to have something substantial to offer. I don't know if I can pay for it. I'm still on Josh's health insurance, and I'm not sure if it's covered." "Hush, child," May said a little sharply. She continued in a slightly softer voice. "We can help. You just need to talk to someone qualified. We can offer support, but we're not therapists, and we don't claim to be. Don't worry about the cost. We'll work it out later." Brooklyn wiped her face, holding a tissue in her hand, looked at the other women and spoke with trepidation. "Why? Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me? Don't you know me? I don't know you. Why are you trying so hard to help me?" There was surprise in her voice, but it was a fair question. In fact, it was the main question of the evening. The reason she was here, in May's house. May made a sound similar to the humph that people make when about to embark on a long and detailed answer. Well, she said for the third time, we all have a past. You've heard us say many times before that we've all gone through it and been where you are now. Those aren't just words. All three of us have in the past taken questionable decisions. All of us have hurt other people, made mistakes, and then often made them worse. We've created a kind of, support network for those who, like us, have made mistakes and need a safe place to talk about it, deal with the situation, and either devote ourselves to trying to recover or, if necessary, move on. Brooklyn recoiled slightly and said, You all screwed up like I did? Oh, baby, Gina said with a smile. You have no idea. Really? Brooklyn asked with a very small smile on her face. That was the first time they had ever seen each other. Oh, yes, Rhonda interjected firmly. Very serious indeed. In fact, May said, at our first meeting, we usually discuss our own situations, so you realize that we're not here to judge you or try to manipulate you. Would you like to hear our stories? Understand who we are and why we can take your situation so lightly? Brooklyn stared at May for a few seconds, trying to comprehend her words, then looked at Gina and Rhonda, then nodded vigorously. Almost surprised. Okay, who wants to go first? May asked, standing up. I'm going to get myself some fresh hot chocolate. Gina? Rhonda? Gina and Rhonda looked at each other, and there was silence for a moment, until Gina said, a little irritably, Sure, I'll go first. It didn't go unnoticed by anyone that it was at this very moment that May carried herself into the kitchen to avoid having to go first. This was May's typical move. While May was in the kitchen, Gina set aside her coffee and made herself comfortable in her chair. Well, let's see, she began. How do we get started? I'm Gina Trellis. I used to be Gina Nape, but not anymore. I'm 38. I've been divorced for almost 4 years. I work as a faculty member at a community college. Not a full professor, more like a mid-level instructor, teaching adult classes for both GED and preparation for a full degree. I primarily teach English, although I teach some physical education classes as well. I spend a lot of time at the gym and have a small career as a pole dancing instructor. I teach belly dance as well, but honestly, most girls want to know how to twirl around a pole and not look stupid. She stopped and smiled shyly. Yeah, I know. It's embarrassing. But, she shrugged, it pays the bills. And you wouldn't believe the body control it takes to hang upside down on a pole for 10 minutes. I was married to Scott. He was wonderful, she said, with a touch of sadness. Everything was wonderful. Everything a marriage should be. Very much like yours, Brooke. We met right out of college. Before I met Scott, I was a party girl. I went to a few parties, met a few guys, and slept with a few of them like every girl does. But I went a little further. But when I met Scott, all the partying stopped, and I was totally okay with that. No hard feelings or anything. I had fun, scattered oats, and saw what was there, and I was totally fine with that. I wrote it off as a life experience and never thought about it again. I had already tried to become a student teacher, which was a nightmare in this town. I met Scott at a party organized by the university's alumni club. It turned out he was an alumnus too, just from another campus. It was love at first sight. I was smitten, and so was he. All those corny and silly things you hear from people? It was all true. The hearts, the flowers, the stars in his eyes, it was all true. We spent the whole night of dating discussing how many children we were going to have, where we were going to live, what religion we were going to raise them in. It sounds really silly now. We were kids. We were raised on all this Disney romance. I thought it was forever, and so did he. And for a while it seemed like it would be. By this point, May had returned, just in time to catch Gina's last words. To everyone's surprise, she nodded in time with Gina's words, expressing her agreement with her in sign language. We started dating quickly. We're already living together after 3 months, and married 9 months later. And it's been great. So much in common. He was a sports massage therapist. He knew what buttons to push, I'll tell you that. And yet, as with all things, familiarity didn't breed contempt, did it? But it sure as hell bred smugness. I look back and I don't know what happened. I was teaching, and there was this guy, you know? There's always that guy. Gina mimicked the quotation marks with her fingers. I don't. Scott was working hard, and this guy was. Interesting. We didn't have kids. We were both doing well with our careers, and Scott thought we'd have to move a few times because of his career and everything, so we put it off. It was just the two of us. He worked hard, doing everything he could to get selected as a massage therapist on one of our Olympic teams. I started teaching at the gym. I started with yoga. This guy, Donnie, was also working at the gym as a private trainer. Well, I'm sure you don't need an introduction. He came to my yoga class to tone up. Yeah, that's right. I imagine he was hardened. I should have been stronger, but one night it just happened. Like you said, Brooke, it suddenly became the most important thing in the world. I have no idea why. Well, I guess you don't have to fantasize too much to see where this is going. The only thing that stopped us for a second was that he ran into the office to turn off the lights and the video recording system, and we carried on. I never once thought about Scott. Nothing about love or a long-term relationship. Well, that's how I justified it afterward. The guilt was there, but honestly, not that strong. Scott would never know, and it was all extremely unimportant to me. I ended up doing it with Donnie 3 or 4 more times over the next few weeks, all just when the opportunity presented itself. To his credit, he never pursued me or stalked me. Everything happened purely when the opportunity arose. I think it meant as little to him as it did to me. We were buddies, nothing more. You see, here's the thing. I remember sitting at home one day after the first time, thinking about it with a bottle of wine, trying to figure out why I did it, since I loved Scott so much. Why would I do something like that? And then it hit me. Since it was outside of my and Scott's life, it had no effect on it. Yeah, sure, it's stupid, but in that moment it made total sense to me. I didn't start loving Scott any less. Figuring out what the new guy liked and didn't like, what his tricks might be, there was nothing more to it than that. Nothing more. I guess I missed the fact that if it was so unimportant, I should have had no problem just not doing it. To me at the time, it made absolutely no difference to my life with Scott. I loved him just as much, even more, because I realized even more how unique he was, what he meant to me. It was the wrong thing to do, of course, but in the end I was convinced that no one could compare to me and Scott. For a while, all the women sat in silence, sipping coffee. May got up, tossed a couple more logs into the fire, and then sat down again, listening to what Gina was saying. The women pondered what Gina had said, studying her statements and trying to relate them to their own experiences. But, Gina continued, I obviously haven't thought this through very well. Just because it didn't mean anything to me doesn't mean it wouldn't mean anything to someone else. To Scott, for example, or to some other fan. And that's what happened. Donnie, it was purely physical. I think he was attracted to me, but once he got what he wanted, the whole relationship became mechanical. We had a few flings, and then he moved to Idaho, and he did it without looking back, and I didn't even bother to say goodbye. That should give you an idea of what, well, just no way, our whole relationship was like. I felt like I had already made up my mind. I needed to find a positive side to what I had done, and that was it. I wasn't looking for more extracurricular fun, but if it happened, Scott had absolutely nothing to do with it. I still adored him. He adored me. Isn't it amazing how easy it is to lie to yourself? Like I said, I teach at the college level. I teach English, specializing in creative writing. A few years after Donnie left, and in those years I wasn't with anyone but Scott, I was teaching classes, and a young author, actually a poet, was taking some of my classes. He had already been published and had done well, but as he said, success made me realize how much I didn't know and how much I relied on the editor to correct my commas. He felt that by becoming a better storyteller, he became a less sharp writer. Interesting, isn't it? So he returned to community college to refocus on the mechanics of writing. And that's how I met Leo. He was younger than me, only 23 years old. He was a poet, one of those fire and brimstone poets who give readings and get so worked up. He was good, too. Spectacular. Gina looked around at the somewhat unsympathetic faces of May, Rhonda, and Brooklyn. Well, he knew. She excused herself, getting a little heated. It didn't hurt that he was dark and gothic and interesting, but one night it happened. It was rather a curiosity on my part. Would the fire and brimstone of his reading manifest itself in bed? As it turned out, yes. He was good. We had a great time. By then, I had long since gotten over the guilt. I'd done a lot of work convincing myself that since it didn't mean anything to me, it shouldn't mean anything to anyone. We did it 6 or 7 times, and I didn't pay much attention to it. But then he started hitting on me. I didn't think much of it. He saw a lot more in our relationship than I did. I mean, I should have. After all, he was a poet, all emotion and no logic. I told him it was just a physical relationship. I love my husband, and he will never replace him for me, no matter what he thinks. We can have fun, but nothing more than that. Of course, he wasn't listening. I didn't notice the signs. The fact that he wrote a poem about me seemed nice, but I didn't read it properly. He waited until the evening reading, when he knew Scott would be there with me, to read his opus, and then confess his love to me at the end, and ask me to leave Scott and become his muse in front of everyone. A truly powerful moment, he thought. Scott thought the whole thing was ridiculous, right up until the moment Leo explained that we already had intimacy. Scott was furious. I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't know Scott could be like that. He turned the table over, big and heavy, to reach Leo, who was suddenly genuinely frightened. You could see it in his eyes. It's one thing to have an emo crowd come up on stage and believe your every word. It's another when a very angry husband who can snap you in half with one hand is trying to push people out of the way, trying to get to you to do just that. Gina stopped, panting slightly. Her eyes widened slightly as she mentally replayed the episode. Scott looked at me when Leo made his statement, and I just couldn't respond to it. He knew right away that it was true, and just went into a rage. He threw one punch at Leo and absolutely flattened him, then everyone piled on top of him. They held him down while other people pulled Leo out. They tried to get me to leave, but I was hysterical and didn't want to, pushing away a couple of people who were trying to push me away. The police came. There were a lot of witnesses pointing at Scott. It all came out. Scott had calmed down a bit by then, but wouldn't talk to me or even look at me. They took Scott away to register him, and I followed in our car. They didn't let him out that night, but they let him out the next day. When Leo left, there was no evidence to hold him or anyone to press charges. I'll never forget the way he came out. He was unshaven, red-eyed, smelled bad, and he didn't even look at me. He just got in the car and we drove home. Not a word was spoken. I didn't know what to say or do. A couple times I tried to say something, but he stopped me with just a look. We got home, he pulled out some bags, and I, knowing where this was going, wouldn't let him leave. I stood in front of the door and begged him to talk to me. I asked him to hit me or beat me or yell at me, anything. But he just stood there and waited, saying nothing but, "Get out of my way, leave me alone," and things like that. It was a dead end. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stop him if he really wanted to leave. I couldn't keep him there, so I let him go. I didn't know what else to do. I had to give him time and space to sort out his feelings. The only thing I knew was that we had to meet and talk so I could explain that I loved him and only him. That all these other infatuations were nothing. You see, even when faced with the reality that what was nothing to me was everything to Scott, I still couldn't see it through his eyes. I believed more in my own bullshit than in his reality, the reality I had created. There was a pause, and then Gina continued. He left, and I didn't see him or hear from him for a week. Then I got an application at work. I was distraught, a complete mess, and they sent me home. After that, I saw him once. One time, can you imagine? I talked him into meeting me for dinner so I could explain everything. I was so nervous. It didn't do anything. I didn't know what to say. A lot of the usual, it doesn't mean anything. I only love you. We can get through this. I'm sorry. Well, what else can you say under those circumstances? He made sure I was okay financially. We sold the house and I got a small one-bedroom apartment in Des Plaines. I never found out where he moved to. His friends scattered to their homes and, although they were cordial to me, kept me at arm's length. His family. Let's just not talk about that. It wasn't pretty. I wasn't getting the slightest hint as to where Scott was or how he was feeling. I was freaking out. What was he thinking? How hurt he must be. Gina twirled her hair in one hand without thinking. She was no longer addressing anyone in particular, just talking to the world. I've been seeing a therapist, the one we're going to send you to Brooke. She helped me finally realize that I had been trying so hard to convince myself that it didn't mean anything. And I truly believe it didn't, that I hadn't even considered what it might mean to someone else. After all, since it didn't mean anything to me, it shouldn't mean anything to anyone else, right? I did such a great job of self-justification that I blinded myself to the fact that I deliberately ignored the thought of what it might do to Scott. And now I think I did it because I knew what the outcome would be, and so I tried my best to cloud my eyes so I'd never think about it. Gina snapped back to reality and smiled sadly but regretfully at the other women present. Guess you really can get yourself confused about stuff, huh? Brooklyn looked horrified and asked uncertainly, "What happened? Did you explain?" "Oh, I explained everything, or tried to. Like I said, as we sat and had dinner, I tried to tell him that I loved him, and only him. That everything that had happened just put it into my head how true that was. It was an unfortunate choice of words, if one is even possible. I tell you, girls. I explained that it's no reflection on him. He's wonderful and beautiful, and I'm the one who messed it up. I did all the things you normally do. Promised him anything if he gave me another chance. He sat and listened and finally said it was all a load of crap. That if I was happy, I would never lose my way. That there had to be something wrong with our relationship or I wouldn't be looking for another. I didn't know how to argue with that. There was nothing wrong with our relationship, but I did it anyway. I tried to explain that I was such a free spirit in college, but at the time, I saw entertainment as nothing more than having a good time, and that was it. That was it. At this, he got even more angry. He said, "If it means so little, why did I do it? Why jeopardize my marriage for something that means nothing?" That was another good point. The therapist doesn't have a good answer to that question either, other than, "I could have, so I did." That's not a good answer even now. It makes me look like a selfish asshole. And he asked another question. If it was so innocent, why did I keep it from him? Why not tell him that and even encourage him for a little piece of nothing on the side? If there was nothing, why hide it? I didn't have an answer to that question. But then I hammered the final nail in the coffin lid. He asked me casually if Leo was the first. I replied fervently that of course he was. I hadn't even thought about Donnie. The whole experience was so disposable that I didn't even think about it. I didn't consciously try to lie. In my mind, he didn't count, and I didn't even think about him. It was years ago, and I had little memory of it. Nor should I have thought about it. But somehow Scott found out about it. I didn't even realize anyone knew about our dates. Of course, I hadn't told anyone, and no one was around when we played. Maybe Donnie. I don't know. One way or another, Scott knew. At least he knew something had happened. As soon as he brought it up, I stopped. I mean, he was right. Trying to talk to Scott, I didn't even remember the experience, so pointless was it. But then again, not to him. He knew right away that I had held back, even though I only did so because it was so forgettable. I wasn't actively trying to lie to him. It just didn't occur to me to mention it. Well, that's about it. If there was any trust, it's gone now. He just looked at me and said something like, "Well, if that's the way you want it, then forget it." He then tossed me a USB drive with a recording on it, which I then listened to. Someone at the gym detailed one of my encounters with Donnie. Apparently, We weren't as alone as I thought. I never saw him in person again. He didn't show up for the divorce hearing, just his lawyer. We split everything, no kids, so that was it. There wasn't much choice on my part. I learned from a friend of a friend that he had moved to San Diego to start over. He moved as far away as he could to be away from me and the memories here. Once in a while, I see pictures of him on Facebook with mutual friends commenting on them or something. He looks good, but I know he doesn't want to talk to me. Brooklyn reached out and took Gina's hand. I'm so sorry. How are you coping? How do you live day to day? Gina shrugged obediently. I go on with my life. You have to. You can't just lie there in your misery. It takes time to deal with independence, finding your own place, dealing with all the crap, all the distractions. It's only when you're settled that the misery really takes over. But I was lucky. May found me and helped me move on with my life. Don't get me wrong, I regret everything. About everything I've done, the results, the disastrous consequences. I do regret it, and this little group is not here to stop it. But what therapy and May have done for me is to help me move past it. It's part of me, and it will always be that way. But at some point, you have to let go of the woe is me and start living again. So I go on dates sometimes. And it's funny because nothing is as guaranteed to make you realize exactly what you've thrown away as dating. Sometimes I meet someone decent and we have fun, but I'm pathologically unable to allow myself even too much happiness. I feel like I'll screw it up again, and those guys don't deserve it. I come and hang out with May and Rhonda, who understand me, and we try to provide support and companionship for those who have made similar mistakes. I miss Scott more than I can say. I miss the way he is, the way we were together, all the stupid things we did. But I made my bed, now I lie in it, and try to do the best I can. The best I can do is lead by example and hope that one day I meet another Scott and find myself in a place where I can accept him, she said with a sigh. Brooklyn took a big sip and impulsively reached out to hug Gina, which surprised Gina, but she agreed anyway. These days, any touch felt good to Gina. She herself was surprised that, having gotten out of the relationship, she simply missed the human companionship that was not suspicious and given freely, with no thought of returning. So here's my story. It sucks, and it doesn't have a happy ending, at least not yet, but at least it proves that life goes on. Okay, I need more coffee. Rhonda, you're up. Gina stood up, more to give herself time to deal with the impending tears than anything else. Rhonda, desperate for a way to change the tension hanging in the air, said wistfully, Well, screw her, Gina. I enjoyed having fun with her. And just like that, Brooklyn and May smiled, and even Gina chuckled for a moment. So what's your story? Brooklyn asked, feeling genuinely curious. She was beginning to relax with these women and didn't feel judged. She was among equals, of questionable background, no doubt, but equals nonetheless. Oh, Rhonda said, waving her hand and waving the question away. My husband and I have gotten into, how shall I put it, dissolving with a few. It was fun. It got out of hand. He kind of got left behind. That's about it. Silence ensued, and May, sipping her hot chocolate, just stared at Rhonda. Rhonda stared back defiantly. May pursed her lips and was about to say something when Rhonda loosened her grip. Oh, okay, she whispered, looking at the floor in disgust. Okay, my story. Okay. If you don't want to, Brooklyn said, holding out her hand to Rhonda. No, May's right. We have to do this. It's just hard, like ripping a Band-Aid off a wound that hasn't fully healed. The women waited for Rhonda to gather her thoughts. Okay, so, yes. Well, I'm Rhonda Frey, Finnish by birth and upbringing. I came to America as an exchange student when I was 18 and managed to get a place at Northwestern University. I got an educational visa, stayed and fell in love with the place. I love Chicago. I love America. I'm a citizen now, you know. I'm never going back to Finland. Land of eternal sunshine half the year and eternal darkness the rest of the time. It's cold and miserable. Here you can be free and go from sunshine to snow in an hour. There are beaches everywhere, lots of stuff. It's splendid. And the men. Oh, the men. I could ride a different cowboy every day. Everyone smiled. Her enthusiasm was contagious. When I was in my final year of college, I studied engineering, and I'll tell you girls, if you want to be pampered, engineering is the place to be. All these men and no choice for them. There just aren't many beautiful women engineers here. I know it's rude, but I've been Miss January and February and March. You know? Anyway, when I was in my senior year, I met Jocelyn. I was so simple then. So small. But Jocelyn, was so worldly, so knowledgeable. He could feel comfortable anywhere. He was a man of the world, and I was right there with him. It was great. His parents had money and he had a trust. He wasn't super rich, but he wasn't worried about the next paycheck either. He was the link. It was a weird thing. He wasn't so much making deals as he was putting together people who were making deals, and he himself got part of the profits for introductions. His family was well known in Chicagoland, and he had access to everyone. And he was able to do it across social strata. He felt as comfortable at a bar on the South Side as he did at Fleming's Steakhouse. And he took me with him. It was exciting. I met him at a college fundraiser. A good-looking engineering student never hurts, and from the first moment there was a connection between us. I learned so much from him. My world and my brain expanded. It was a whirlwind romance, just like in the movies. He was kind to me. Kind. Took the time to explain everything I didn't know about this country. Well, I'm sure you can see where this is going. We were married 10 months after we met. My parents came from Finland and hated America at first sight, but they smiled and put up with it for me. Tolerated, Gina interjected, smiling. What? Rhonda asked. That's tolerated. Past tense, not tolerated. Sorry, English teacher, I can't help it. Rhonda looked at Gina for too long, then continued. Yes, they roughed me up. She put quotation marks on her fingers. Gina picked up her coffee and smiled, greeting her. 13 years in this country and she's still correcting me. Rhonda rolled her eyes. Gina's smile grew even wider. Anyway, Rhonda said caustically, we were married. Things were good. I had a couple kids like a good wife should. We have a boy, Xander, and a girl, Lena. Everything was great for about 4 or 5 years, and then things went downhill. You know how it is. I love my kids, but it felt like I was living their lives instead of my own. Joss and I slowed down. He had more things to do and he was traveling for a big deal he was organizing. Brooklyn bit her lip and looked at Rhonda. Rhonda noticed this and indignantly replied, No, it's not like that. I didn't go to someone else's bed while he was at work. He came home, the deal was done, and then we talked. I mean, really talked. About what we wanted, about how our lives weren't that interesting. We could talk, you know, when we wanted to. We both realized that life wasn't that interesting, and we wanted to solve that problem. And we talked to each other. Rhonda stared into space for a moment with a wistful expression on her face. After a moment, she waved it away and continued. Anyway, we wanted to bring some excitement back into our lives. So we started talking about fantasies. We started talking about our relationship, how strong it was, and what we could do and still stay on good terms with each other. I know he wanted a threesome with another woman. They all do, don't they? The women all smiled and nodded. We've talked about this, how it could happen. And I said, if he gets a threesome with a woman, what about me? Would I get a threesome with another guy? How would he feel about that? I wasn't threatened in the slightest by another woman. We had a long discussion about what we could do, what was okay, what wasn't, and so on. I had to see it. I had to see what it meant. I'm an engineer, for crying out loud. I'm logical and I can see how one thing leads to another. But I missed this important event. That's the right word, isn't it? Big? Anyway, in the end, we decided that we would give it a try. So we did. It was interesting. But Joss didn't like it at all. It's so obvious now. I was so selfish. I got what I wanted. No, what I didn't even realize I wanted. And he got almost nothing. Just watched me have fun. He could have said no, but he didn't. But in that moment, as he said later, he brushed me off, seeing what I was saying. He wasn't saying yes or no. He was letting me decide. He was reacting to what I decided to do. That night, back home, we drifted apart. He was never going to come back. He was so angry with me, and I just vented my anger on him. It was just awful. He was so hurt by it, and I just wanted to go and hug him, and he left the bedroom and the house. He didn't come back for 3 days. I called him and left messages, but I didn't know where he had gone. Eventually, he came back. He had been on a bender with friends. Our relationship was never the same again. Every time there was intimacy, it felt like there was someone else next to us. I knew I was on thin ice, so I just let things go. It took a while, but things mostly went back to normal. It was his birthday, and I got a hotel room, and I think he had a good time. But I was so careful. I didn't want any bad images to pop up in his head. So all the way up until Halloween, everything was fine. We had a tradition. We always went trick-or-treating with the kids who live next door to his parents. They live in Palatine, and their neighborhood is very popular for that kind of thing. Kind of like the place they go to on Halloween. Where we lived, not so much. And then they would stay at Grandma and Grandpa's and eat all the candy because Grandma and Grandpa are so easy on them, and we would go to a party instead. We might have ended up at Russian Division or at a party at someone Joss knew. And this year, Joss had to go out of town. He had a financing deal for some TV show and was supposed to be in LA for Halloween. And I sat there wondering what I was going to do. The kids would be happy with their grandparents, and I'd be alone. And I did something so colossally stupid. I got dressed up and went to a club. Halloween is a massive party night for these clubs, even more so than New Year's Eve. I thought, Joss will never know, and I can have some of that awesome fun, and no one will be upset this time. Looking back, I think, how stupid I could have been. Things were getting better with Joss and me, but I couldn't stop thinking about how good it had been there, and I wanted more. But I didn't want Joss to be mad at me, and this seemed like the easiest way to do it. No one got hurt, and I certainly wasn't in it for love. Still, I went. It was a great thing to do. Every couple months I managed to find a way to go by myself. In doing so, I made sure Joss was well taken care of. Everything was fine, until the wheels fell off. Rhonda paused for a drink. When she looked back, she saw all 3 women staring at her intently. Joss was at some golf event in Milwaukee one night and stayed the night. I went and partied like I always do. To make a long story short, there was another couple there that night that I didn't know and had only met in passing. But they knew me. And they knew Joss. And when they noticed me walking around, they couldn't believe it. They told Joss, of course. He hadn't been back from Milwaukee for a week, and I had no idea he knew what I was doing. He just said I had things to do. When he got back, a private investigator figured out from the club records that I'd been there, filed an affidavit, somehow got some of the people I'd been hanging out with to testify. I saw Dan and Sandy one more time. They were the ones who told me about how much pain I had inflicted on Joss. By then, it had all come out. I ran into them at TGI Fridays like no other place. I was there to meet someone, and they were sitting at the bar watching a hockey game. I sat down with them, and they talked for a bit about what I was doing, going to the club alone, and how their conversation with me about balance was lost on me. Their whole, it doesn't matter much thing was based on balance, right? It doesn't matter only if there is balance, when both sides are balanced, even over time. And in our case, that didn't happen. I only made the debt situation worse. I didn't even think about it. I just thought that when we went, he didn't have a good time, refused, but it was still interesting to me. The thing is, as my therapist pointed out, I knew it wasn't something I should have done, even if I ignored his influence. I knew, or I would have said something, but I never did. I don't know. Rhonda's pronunciation became more and more distinct, more and more jerky, and her use of vowels became more and more emphasized as she spoke. The more emotion she felt, the more the American manner of speech was erased. After I was singed out, Joss came in one day and just threw all his stuff out of the house. He ended up moving to Minneapolis. He was humiliated, and so was his family. Remember, they know them in Chicago. He had no choice, really. He ended up becoming a business professor at the University of Minneapolis. He took the kids, too. He had top-notch lawyers that his family knew as friends. And me, well, I hung out at a club. It wasn't a pageant, and I knew it. I take my kids 1 weekend a month, every vacation, and for 6 weeks in the summer. It's not a lot, but I still keep in touch with them. There's a lot of Skyping. It's better than I deserve. There was silence for a while, the women digesting the last story. I miss the life I had. We were a real family. I'm sorry, Brooklyn said, genuinely touched by Rhonda's story. Like Gina before her, she reached out to touch Rhonda's hand. Rhonda put her hand on Brooklyn's arm and said, "It's okay. I made my bed. We all make our beds. We just have to learn to accept it and move on. Someday I will. Until then, lots of meaningless fun with attractive men." The last was said with false bravado, but it diffused the tension of the moment. Then Rhonda said uncertainly, "Do you want to know the strangest thing? Even though we're divorced, we still see each other occasionally. When he's in town, he calls, we meet at his hotel. It took a while for that to happen, but now it's happening. He even asked if I still perform in clubs, and I told him the truth, that yes, sometimes. And he asked about what I was doing. It wasn't to poke fun at me, but just because he was interested. And I tell you, girls, if I could get him to go with me one more time, I'd make him the happiest man in the world." Then she added, "Well, a girl can dream. I just wish he could be there with me. I think what ruined us wasn't going to the club. It was the way I acted while there. I went overboard and destroyed his faith and trust in me. If I hadn't screwed up." There was a wistful note in Rhonda's voice, and then, after a moment, she shrugged and said, "Joka mene te muisteli, si te tikula sil mayen." Brooklyn looked incomprehensively at Rhonda, who replied, "A Finnish proverb. It means a jab in the eye to those who dwell on the past." "Ah," Gina said wisely, as if she had guessed what Rhonda was talking about. "How about another drink? I'm sure the coffee pot needs attention," May said, rising from her chair. She picked up the coffee set and, humming to herself, retired to the kitchen. Gina looked at Rhonda and asked quietly, "Do you think she'll tell everything? Everything?" "I don't know," Rhonda replied. Brooklyn looked back at both of them confused. "What? She's going to tell her story?" "That's exactly what I was asking. We've learned about her in bits and pieces before, but never fully told her story. Honestly, none of us have the courage to ask her. She has this way of pushing you away, you know?" "The nicest way to say back off," Gina said. "What do you know?" Brooklyn asked. "There was some kind of long-standing affair. It came to light. Bad things happened, that's all, really." "Well, I guess that's right," came a voice from behind them. May reappeared with an updated coffee set. Gina looked at Rhonda in a panic. "Well, isn't that nice?" May said in as kind a tone as possible, but looking at Gina and Rhonda, her words couldn't be misunderstood. Rhonda and Gina were looking at the floor and the coffee pot, respectively, avoiding each other's gaze. "So, May, what's your story?" Brooklyn asked innocently, turning in her chair to face her. "My story?" May replied in a quiet, thoughtful voice. "Well, yes. I guess it's time. I've never fully told it to anyone. Parts, perhaps. Bits and pieces. Things I've chosen to share, but maybe it's time. As I've been told, bearing your soul is good for her." She smiled sincerely at Brooklyn, then said softly, "Yes, and those two who didn't have the courage to ask can listen too." Gina and Rhonda raised their eyes and looked at each other. A wide smile appeared on Gina's face, like a teenager who has been caught doing something he's not really ashamed of. Rhonda smiled back and leaned forward to fill her coffee cup. Are we all settled in? Yes? Good, May said, settling into a chair. So, let me tell you about Randall. My Randall. My God, that man was everything to me. I met him in 1975. He had just gotten back from serving in the Cambodian embassy as a young Marine. Everyone was evacuated when the Khmer Rouge took over Phnom Penh, the capital of the country. She looked at the incomprehensive looks from Brooklyn, Gina, and Rhonda. Never mind the ancient history. Suffice it to say he was a young Marine and very handsome. He was with his friend, Ronnie Cordell. I knew Ronnie from high school. He was a soccer jock, so everybody knew Ronnie. He became friends with Randall while he was in the service, and Randall came back here on vacation with him. We were at the dance. Well, disco, actually. That was the time. I was never interested in it, but my friends loved to dance, and the Bee Gees, Donna Summer, they were on trend. I was working as a nurse at the time. I met Randall at some club, I forget which one, in Champaign-Urbana, where I lived, and I was smitten at first sight. I could tell you what he was wearing, what I was wearing. I can even tell you what song was playing. It was Love to Love You Baby by Donna Summer. He was wearing jeans, boots, and a plaid shirt, and I was wearing a yellow sundress. She paused, looking off into the distance and remembering the past. He was so handsome. He was standing there with a beer in his hand, and I was just looking at him. Then Ronnie came over and said hello, and introduced me to Randall, and I was stuttering and babbling, and he took pity on me and asked me to dance. It was heaven. He was heaven. I didn't know it was him I was waiting for, but I was. That night I realized I was going to marry him. We had 4 dates, and no sex, thank you. And then he had to leave again, back in the service. He wrote every day and called when he could. He came back every vacation when he could. He was stationed in Georgia as part of the security detail at some base. By his 4th leave, he proposed to me, and I said yes before he even finished asking. A year later, he discharged, moved to Urbana to be with me, and we started living together. I lived with him. Even in the 70s, it wasn't exactly what ladies of my upbringing did, as my mother used to say, but I wanted him so badly I did it anyway. We got married a year later, and it was bliss. Just the best day of my life. Not like today's weddings. Small, just our friends, and such a lovely night. Perfect temperature, not too long. No drunk uncles, just perfect. And the night, oh my God, this man knew how to love. I mean, I wasn't a virgin. This was the 70s. The burning of bras in the previous decade, and everything else meant there was a lot of experimentation. I was around and exploring a bit. I knew the difference between a confident lover and one who was clumsy. Or worse, a confident lover whose confidence was misplaced. That's the worst, you know. And thankfully, Randall was confident for all the right reasons. Looking back, I still don't know why we waited. I think it was misplaced chivalry, and on my part, an attempt to be like my parents' generation, with a man I truly loved. I look at today's kids and the way they jump in and out of bed with everyone before marriage, and I can't help but think it's a healthier lifestyle. Knowing you're compatible with your partner before the marriage commitment is just better, isn't it? Bottom line. Suffice it to say, Randall was great. Loving, confident, attentive, smart, funny, soft and accommodating when he needed to be, and hard as concrete when he needed to be. My perfect man. We lived in an apartment in downtown Urbana, and he took a job there as the property manager, or as you would say today, construction manager. He was both a handyman fixing things, an office manager checking out new tenants, and everything in between. It was a fantastic time. It seemed like anything was possible. He had no family except for a brother in Idaho whom we saw periodically, and my family, my mom and 2 sisters. My dad died of heart failure in 1972, and his parents died in a plane crash in 1968. We were happy. We saved money and bought a small, well, not so small these days, apartment, and life was great. I worked at the hospital for an oncologist, and Randall fiddled around the house. 3 years after we were married, I got pregnant, and we had Ezra, my little Bonnie boy. He hated that expression. Then Ellie, 18 months later, and finally Cameron, my baby, about 2 years later. You can see them in the pictures on the mantle. The women all turned to look at the many pictures on the mantelpiece. Shots of May with small children, grown children, individuals, in places like the Grand Canyon and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Gina and Rhonda had seen them before, but never knew exactly who was pictured. They guessed it was May's family, but she never reported it, and they never had the courage to ask. The picture is of Randall and the two boys, she said, sipping warm hot chocolate. Randall was a large man, almost 6'2". His hair had thinned, but he hadn't succumbed to the dreaded comb-over, just cut it short. Both of his boys kept up with his height in the picture of the two of them with the Statue of Liberty in the background. He had piercing blue eyes, which both of his sons also had. The goofy smile indicated a sense of humor, as did the fact that he made bunny ears behind both of his boys' heads, clearly unaware of it. We traveled everywhere. That's what we both loved. All over the States, indeed, all over the world. We've been to Egypt, Asia, Europe. I loved London. Randall did too. He stared off into the distance for another long time. More memories of better times. He was so good to me, and I was so good to him. We just understood each other, you know? It was a couple made in heaven. I gave him what he needed, and he gave me what I needed. We ended up doing well. He ended up owning the building he managed and then bought several other buildings. By the time we broke up, we owned 2 apartment buildings, 3 office buildings, and 3 parking lots, as well as 4 duplexes and our own house. After 8 years of marriage, we moved to a much nicer place. There was an indoor pool and even a pool house. It was all very fancy and cool, let me tell you. Our 4th of July parties were the talk of the town. I got into politics when the kids were grown. I was bored, so I quit my nursing job when Ellie was born. Randall supported me and even helped fund my first run for city council. The next thing I knew, I was running for mayor. And I won. Sort of. I mean, I actually got elected. Those were cool times, girls. Like I said, everything seemed possible. And it was, right up until the end. A silence ensued, during which May only frowned. Rhonda and Gina fidgeted with impatience, and Brooklyn sat with rapt attention. Well, that was Randall. He was my everything. That's why it's so hard to talk about Dexter. May looked uncertainly at the other women, pondering if she was really acting reasonably. In for a penny, in for a pound, she thought to herself. They bared their souls. And continued. So, Dexter, he was everything that Randall wasn't. Or more to the point, Randall was everything Dexter wasn't. Randall was steady and solid. Dexter was flighty and always going somewhere. Randall epitomized determination, while Dexter ran from commitment like a cancer. Randall thought out everything he was going to do, and Dexter, if the thought crossed his mind, did it. Randall had a slow and quiet sense of humor, while Dexter thought everything that happened was unrestrainedly funny and made fun of everything. Randall had been long and hard at getting everything he had, while Dexter came to him easily and left just as easily. One day he spent thousands. The next day he found himself owing thousands. I'm sure you girls know what I mean. He wasn't so much a bad boy, as they put it, as he was a little boy. But he was fun, and for some reason we just couldn't leave each other alone. I'd met him before Randall, and we'd had a torrid affair for 3 or 4 months. It wasn't a fulfilling relationship, which became clear very quickly. Dexter wasn't just a runaway. He had a wandering eye, wandering hands, and a lack of maturity and conscience. Frankly, after 2 or 3 days in his company, you just had to talk to an adult. But there was something about him, like a wounded bird. It was impossible to resist the urge to coddle him and make him laugh. When I met Randall, I hadn't seen Dexter in months. I realized who Randall was as soon as I met him. He was my soulmate. But Dexter, he was my playmate, if you know what I mean. He'd show up for weeks at a time. We'd make time to hang out. I just couldn't resist him. Even when we got married, it continued. Like you ladies, I knew exactly where and who was buttering my bread, So Dexter was something of a naughty interlude for me, like a bad habit. He knew he had no chance of anything long-term with me, of a real relationship, but he'd show up after spending 8 months in Paris or somewhere, call me, and we'd meet for a cup of coffee and then spend a couple hours chatting. You mean hooking up, don't you, May? Gina said, a little caustically. May, the matriarch, was in front of her, and she finally recognized herself as human. Gina couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. May sighed. If you mean we did physical training, then yes, it happened. Dexter was wildly imaginative, Randall less so. Dexter, on the other hand, could already tell you what you could or couldn't do to her. Randall wasn't boring. But Dexter, well, you just never knew what he'd do the next moment. That went on for years. He was like my second husband, who was away a lot. He'd come back, tell me stories about where he'd been, what he'd done, who he'd done things with. He was never shy about telling me about other women. But then he'd stroke my cheek and say, "But none of them are like you, May." And then he'd kiss me, and I'd just smile at his impertinence. I didn't really care. He wasn't mine and I wasn't his. I had my own man back home. Dexter was so comfortable. I think that's the word for it. He even bought me a ring. It had "always there," waiting inscribed on the inside, which I thought was unusually poignant for Dexter at the time. I wore it on my right hand, on the same finger as my ring finger. I know it's very silly. Stupid? Interjected an instantly emboldened Gina. It wasn't stupid, it was outrageous. To put his mark on yourself? And wearing it? That's already bold, May. May just looked at Gina calmly, then said with a hesitation, "Yes, you're right. I shouldn't have done it. I knew what it was, what it symbolized. I shouldn't have even thought about it. But I had some stupid thoughts about a woman who had everything. A husband she was devoted to, and a lover who scratched an itch. It was pure arrogance and lack of thought on my part. Fortunately, Randall had no idea of any of it." There was silence as the other women began to realize the enormity of what May had done. The long betrayal of the man she supposedly loved with all her heart. It was a hard thing to realize. They had been weak, but this had been deliberate, over the course of many years. Going back to the story, when he was in town, we found ways to meet, sometimes at his house, and if Randall was in Chicago, the 2 buildings we owned were in Chicago, he would come to our house and sneak into the pool room from the back door. I never let him into the main house. It belonged to Randall and me, not him. You know what the funny thing is? Dexter was so disconnected from my main life, with Randall and the kids, that I didn't even feel guilty about the time we spent together. I mean, it was what I'd been doing all along, and Randall had never suffered for it. It was like Dexter was just an old friend that I'd occasionally exercise with. I didn't even give it a second thought. He was like an old pair of slippers or a favorite hairdresser. But we had fun. I learned a few things that I'll definitely take with me to Randall. We did some unusual things that just confirmed that I don't love them. I won't go into details. Others here feel more comfortable than I do, she said, raising an eyebrow at Rhonda, who just stared back. A woman should have a bit of mystery, I think, but I will say that bondage is not for me. Neither is all that humiliation and name-calling. If I'm there, I'm a full partner in what's going on, not some little brownie to be ordered around. And when Dexter brought in another man, I kicked them both out, and Dexter didn't show up again for almost a year. I have my standards. Or I thought I had, she said quietly after a moment. The thing is, when you get away with it for years, you stop thinking about what you're really doing, what impact it's going to have. It's been a part of your life for so long that it feels like it's normal. You stop thinking about it as something wrong, even if you make sure no one knows about it. You stop thinking about why things work the way they do, and it just becomes part of your life. It's something you do. I had this life, a government job, my main man by my side, a love that would never end, and a bit of casual fun with an old friend that no one knew about and who posed no threat to any of it anyway. Except himself. Public office. It's a strange thing. I was ready for it when the opportunity presented itself. I was the Republican candidate, back when the Republican Party actually stood for something other than big business, religious zealots, and hypocrisy. Given that we owned buildings, we were known in the community, we did community service, we were thought of relatively well, I think. When they came knocking, it didn't come as a surprise. I was already on the council and had done a relatively good job trying to deal with the public school system in Urbana, so I had experience. When the local party approached me, I wasn't all that surprised. Randall was beyond thrilled, and I was very proud and honored too. We just decided together that this was something we could do. I could do the job, and it was a way to serve the community, to leave a legacy after our children, even though they were very important. So we got down to business. The party and Randall organized a fund to help finance my campaign, and we enthusiastically got down to business. I spent time kissing babies and shaking hands, and sometimes kissing hands and shaking babies. Gina smiled at the weak joke, and Rhonda just stared at her, not understanding the joke. Brooklyn was simply fascinated by May's story. It's been a long, hard labor. Late nights, lots of decisions I had no right to make. Money was spent on flyers, events, advertising, and canvassers. We had potluck dinners and plate nights at $100 a plate, fundraisers, and I showed up all over town helping out at soup kitchens and anything else that needed to be done. It was hard work. Midway through, Dexter showed up again, having returned from Hong Kong where he was working for some group hauling their equipment. Not all the late nights were spent campaigning. Some of them spent in his motel room or pool house. However, I tried to spend much more time at home to make sure Randall was well taken care of. But what I didn't count on was the other party. They wanted the position of mayor, and they weren't bent on using covert methods to get it. I didn't realize they were looking into my past for any dirt they could find. Luckily, I was white. Well, except for Dexter. But honestly, he was already just part of the furniture to me. But other than him, and no one knew about our ongoing relationship, I hadn't shared it with anyone, and I don't think he had either, unless you counted the one person he'd brought to us once. There was nothing to find. Of course, that didn't stop them. When they found nothing in my past, they just redoubled their efforts. They started following me. And that's where it all came crashing down. I won the election, but no sooner had I taken office than there was an article in the paper about the new mayor's morals. If she cheated on her husband, what would she do in office? I was devastated. They had pictures of my meeting with Dexter, some not-so-flattering pictures that had been censored. There was no way to deny it. It was the end of my mayoralship. I resigned before I even took office. The city council had to choose a new mayor. It was such a mess. But whatever happened to my career was nothing compared to what happened to my relationship. Randall was destroyed. I saw him at home one day after the newspaper article came out. He was distraught. He asked me if it was true, and I couldn't even look him in the eye, at least not without blinking. He knew right away that it was. I mumbled something. I tried to minimize the damage, to let him know how little it meant that he was my man, my exalted king. Gina and Rhonda looked at each other. Only May could use the word sublime when describing the demise of her marriage. In desperation, I said something very stupid, something like, "As long as we've been married, have you ever once, even for a second, felt that I didn't support you 100%? It was one of the dumbest things I've ever said in my life." Randall was even more crushed. I expected him to rant and rage, smash things, maybe even hit me, and for me to be patient and ask for more. But he didn't do any of that. He was too good a man for that. I should have known better. He just stood there, shaking, tears streaming down his face. I pitched forward to take him in my arms, to make things right, like I'd done so many times during our marriage. But he didn't care for that. He pulled back, and I realized he didn't want physical contact with me, which was very painful. I was well aware of how much damage I'd done, but facing it this way, well. He just turned and went upstairs, and I followed him, trying to explain how much I loved him and only him, and that this long affair has only strengthened me in that. May raised her eyebrows at the other women in a self-deprecating gesture. Yes, I was really trying to equate a 30-year affair as being good for our marriage. I'm sure you ladies said equally stupid things when the relationship came out. It speaks to the desperation, the frantic attempts to stop the train wreck. We've all been there. It was not a pretty sight. I sobbed and was willing to do or say anything to make it better. It's so ridiculous when we say we will do anything to make it better. I remember when Deanna said that to Ryan, and he asked, "What would you do to make it better?" No answer, right? But I offered, thinking I could somehow. But it wasn't meant to be. Randall packed a bag, military guys pack fast, and just walked past me. I sobbed and collapsed in the doorway of our bedroom. I tried to grab his leg as he walked by, but he just walked on. I honestly don't know who sobbed more, me or him. He was gone in a second. I don't need to tell you ladies how bad I felt after that. As I said, I resigned over the phone, apologizing to the local party leaders. They had nothing to say except resignation accepted. I asked them to alert the media, which they did. For the next few days, I hardly went outside. The kids all contacted me, and Cameron came to see me the next day. He was in Chicago anyway. All he did was worry about me, and I could barely talk to him coherently. He didn't even ask about the affair, just worried about my well-being. Ellie and Ezra arrived near the end of the week. By then, however, what I had done had become known. Of course, there were no details. No one knew it was long-term. At first, the kids consoled me and just worried. And then, one by one, they grew cold. They were at their dad's house and he gave them some details, like the duration. Apparently, he also started investigating the affair, found Dexter, and Dexter, after threats from very large men, completely and thoroughly laid out everything he thought. And then he ran away, far, far away. Honestly, I didn't expect anything else from him. Dexter was always more concerned with himself than anything else. So Randall knew everything, or at least everything Dexter told him. I tried to contact him repeatedly, calling, leaving messages, texting. Texting was new then, but Randall was always very up-to-date, emailing him, sending letters through his office. When I called his office, his assistant Tracy had just informed me that he wasn't in and had left instructions that he would be gone for a while. I had no idea where he was staying. A hotel, one of the apartments in our buildings. I had no idea. May paused, taking a deep breath to rid herself of this very emotional memory. As it turned out, the kids hadn't heard from him for some time. Ezra thought Randall had gone off somewhere to lick his wounds. Ellie and Cameron were sure he would get in touch when he recovered from the shock. But that didn't happen. There was complete silence, aside from the ticking of the clock, even louder if possible, as the other women froze in anticipation of May's every word. If a pin had fallen to the floor at that moment, it would have made the sound of a gong striking. She looked at them, trying to smile, and the smile hid the pain and seething emotions behind her eyes. Randall died 4 days before our 30th anniversary, 5 days after he found out what I was doing. Brooklyn sighed slightly, and both Gina and Rhonda were taken aback. "I'm so sorry, May," Gina said, on autopilot as she picked up the words. "Yes, I'm sorry for your loss," Rhonda added. Brooklyn just sat with her hand covering her mouth in shock, eyes glistening in the corners. Randall's body had been found at the local Marriott Hotel 4 days after Cameron had last spoken to him. He had been dead for 2 days. According to the coroner, it was a massive heart attack caused by stress. Apparently, his heart swelled and misfired, and then stopped, and he died almost immediately. That's what they said at the inquest. But I knew more. I know what Randall died of. It was a broken heart, and I broke it. May's voice broke at the last sentence, and she busied herself searching for a napkin among the coffee utensils on the table so the other women wouldn't see the tears in the corners of her eyes. Finding one, she looked up and saw the other women look away in respect for her feelings. She wiped her eyes and then said, "It's okay, ladies. It's just that I'm silly and emotional." To her surprise, it was Brooklyn who leaned forward and said with sympathy in her voice, "May, that's perfectly normal and understandable. If you've never told this story before, if I may say so, now is the time. You need to unload a little, and so do we. Gina and Rhonda looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. This new girl was showing a resilience neither of them had expected. Her sympathy was striking and genuine. Only 4 days until our 30th anniversary. 4 days. The kids and I were planning a big party, a celebration of my victory in the mayoral election and our joint anniversary combined. There was dead silence in response to that statement. And that was 2 days before his birthday. Jesus, Gina whispered. Helvetii, Rhonda said, also in a sotto voice. Brooklyn just sat there stunned. And I killed him. As sure as I was, he died from the shock of what I did. No one knew what to say to that. Pure denial would have been obvious. Finally, Gina made an attempt. May, you can't know that. If his heart was enlarged, he probably had something that would have caused problems anyway. May only looked at her sadly and replied, Maybe. But he had a shock, and he died, and I was responsible for that shock. I don't think it's possible to disagree with that. And I'll have to live with that knowledge. What I did, what I continued to do, didn't just kill my marriage, it killed the thing I loved most in the world, my husband. It killed a decent and wonderful man, and I live with that every day. Everyone was silent for a moment, pondering this whole unfortunate story, and then May continued. Well, of course, I couldn't stay in Champaign-Urbana any longer. For obvious reasons, I was an outcast in the community. My sisters hardly spoke to me. A phone call on my birthday, a card at Christmas, no Thanksgiving invitations, as you can imagine. I moved here as soon as I could and bought this apartment. I ended up getting everything in our lives, the business, the buildings, everything else. I was a very rich woman. But the kids, well, it wasn't right. I'd betrayed Randall the whole time we were married, and I didn't deserve everything. So I took a small amount from the business to survive, and then turned everything over to them. They could run it, sell it, or do whatever they wanted. It was their birthright, not mine. Neither Gina nor Rhonda knew exactly what May and Randall inherited upon his death. The entire inheritance, after wills and taxes, totaled almost $15 million. May took $2 million and gave the rest to the children. Even now, having paid cash for the house she now lived in, she was still a relatively wealthy woman. And very quietly, she had set up an educational trust fund for Rhonda's children. They wouldn't find out about it until they were college age, but none of them would graduate with debt. It was set up in her husband's name. Cameron tolerates my presence for the sake of his children. I spoil my 2 grandchildren to death from him, at least as much as I'm allowed to. But they don't come to visit. I think I am considered a bad influence, and in this, I dare say, they are not wrong. It's all quite understandable. Ellie talks to me and comes to visit occasionally. She is still single, and I think she may have found a new beau. She has mentioned him more than once. But we are not as close as we used to be. And Ezra, my dear boy, I haven't heard from him. He told me at the funeral that I was dead to him for what I had done, and he more than proved that he would fulfill his promise. I have heard from others that he has married and has 2 children, but I have never seen them, and I suppose I never will. But for all the unhappiness with the children, my greatest regret is that I was not able to apologize properly to Randall. He died without ever knowing that he was my knight in shining armor. That everything I told him was pure truth. I loved him completely. Dexter was just entertainment. A time when I could be someone other than Mrs. Randall Morgan, even though I loved being her. Dexter was like a favorite pet, and Randall never knew or understood that. I lost the best thing I ever had in my life, and now I have this. And she gestured to the other women sitting in the living room. Don't get me wrong, ladies, I'm grateful for this. Believe me. But if I had to trade you for Randall, well, that wouldn't be an easy decision, I'll tell you that. Gina chuckled softly, Rhonda smiled briefly, and Brooklyn even chuckled sadly. They could understand each other. They would have made the same choice too. The only reason I'm telling this story Even though those two Hari are trying to get it out of me, May said to Brooklyn, waving her hand at Gina and Rhonda, who recoiled in mock horror, is that Dexter died last week. I got a message from an old high school friend in Urbana. I was contemplating whether or not to go to the funeral, but in the end I decided I'd rather not. Dexter has already taken enough from me. Or, more accurately, I've already given enough. I need to pay my respects to Randall's memory, and my showing up at Dexter's funeral wouldn't be the right signal. It's not much, but it's all I can do. She took one last sip of the cooled chocolate, wrinkled her face, and hurriedly set it aside. So, that's the whole story. Now, Brooklyn, I hope you realize that we understand your situation. We're not going to justify it. What you've done and continue to do is reprehensible. But you know that, and we're not going to go on and on about it. All we can offer is support, advice, and a place where you don't have to constantly defend yourself. If that's what you're interested in, we're here. Rhonda has already said that she would love to have you stay with her for a while, if only to help you curb these self-destructive impulses coming from your husband's brother. This has to end, and I think you know that. A temporary respite from guilt is one thing, but it only prolongs the agony. Josh, right? If he's still talking to you, it'll stop if it all continues and comes out, as I'm sure you realize. But, without saying it, you see who we are, what we've been through. You see that we only want to help. Are you interested in that? I can guarantee you'll get a sympathetic ear, lots of sarcasm, spicy gossip. We'll be here and on your side. We won't help you destroy your ex, but we'll be here to help you pick up the pieces of your life. Sound good? Brooklyn looked at May, her eyes shining, then at Gina and Rhonda, then back at May. Her voice shook when she said, I think it sounds good. I need good news so badly right now. New friends. Thank you for being there for me. Thank you for helping me. Her voice broke at the end, and May leaned forward and patted Brooklyn on the back of her palms. It won't be easy, but you're not alone now, child. Rhonda, it's time for you to help this lady pack. Before you go. May got up and went to the kitchen, then returned, carrying a bottle of Wollersheim Prairie Fume wine. Here. I suspect you two will need a bottle or two tonight. This one's on me. It's a good wine, this Prairie Fume. Won 2 gold medals, don't you know? Who'd have thought Wisconsin could make great wine? She handed the bottle to Rhonda, who nodded appreciatively to May as the other 3 women stood up. Thanks, May, Rhonda said. Same time next week? I'll be there, May replied as they walked to the front door, and all the women put their protective clothing back on, ready to face the cold weather. Wishing them goodbye and giving them a quick hug before leaving, May closed the door and stood in the hallway for a few moments looking back. Silly old woman, she scolded herself. He's dead and gone and never coming back. But then she looked up and said timidly, But I wish it were not so. I love you, Randall. I'll never stop. Then she frowned and went to remove the coffee from the living room. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.